right, good afternoon, and hopefully your lunch was settling okay. My metric, especially if the after lunch slot, is either a good nap or at least keeping you from losing your lunch. so something in between those two. My name's Eric Hibbard. I'm with Samsung Semiconductor. I've been heavily involved in the security and privacy space for way too long. Those of us that are chasing the bad guys, so to speak, are getting grayer and grayer. We're not seeing lots of new blood coming into the field. And frankly, in many ways, we are not winning the battle. We are just trying to sort of maintain. So I try and do a talk here for the developer community to kind of give a sense of what we're up against, because in many ways, what I find is developers are 5 or 6 hops away from where the action actually is, and they don't understand, for example, what's happening in nation-state kinds of adventures or organized crime kind of adventures. And I can tell you, in a previous position, I was involved in multiple homicide investigations, that included the use of getting access to storage systems. So it can be a pretty nasty space when you kind of look beyond just we've got an incident, but you really see what's happening in the real world. So the goal here is to sort of paint a picture for you, and then maybe give you some things to consider in your activities. Okay, so as I call that, a little bit of the backstory. What we're seeing from a threat landscape is not a lot of change, and in the sense of not a lot of additional things, but that's not necessarily good news, because these kinds of things are continuing to happen. Well, let's see. I think the current feed is about 50 incidents, new incidents per day, is kind of what we're seeing. And it kind of goes up and down. I've seen spikes as high as a couple hundred in a single day, and maybe as low as 30. But all kinds of things that are going on. And I'm sure in your organizations, ransomware has probably hit your radar scope. This is something that comes down to the storage layer, because it basically is impacting data. So we've definitely been looking for a while to see if there's a way that we can kind of help mitigate those kinds of problems. But all of these are alive and well, and getting even more complicated in terms of trying to mitigate. And it's not just sort of governments and large corporations. How many of you are familiar with the brand Clorox? You know that brand? Okay. So if you've actually had to go out and buy bleach lately, you might not actually find it on the store shelves. They are suffering from a ransomware attack from a few weeks ago that is basically impact their production. So yeah, you'll go home tonight and tell your wife, if you have a wife, to go buy Clorox if you can find it, because it doesn't look like their recovery is going well, and it's actually hit them at the manufacturing level. Anyways, in the security world, these are the kinds of things that we are trying to combat. They're, as I said, regular attacks. There's some fun denial of service attacks that are happening right now. Some of the in the gamer community got a little agitated over recent release, and well, basically the site's been almost down for a few days, and it's continuous. And these are big ticket items for some of these companies. These are millions of dollars a day in terms of losses. Okay, so and who are the actors that are sort of at play here? We've got a lot of cyber terrorism that is still underway. As you can probably guess, government-sponsored and state-sponsored actors are extremely active right now for obvious reasons, not only in Europe, but in Asia-Pacific region as well. Not that the U.S. is immune from playing in this space as well, But this is a very, very, I'd say the relative to last year, the amount of activity is at least twice what we've been seeing in many sectors. Organized crime, very organized, very focused on money, very well staffed, very well equipped, and they're continuing to improve. So this group is particularly ruthless because they're basically after, well, anything. And if they focus on your activity, woe be you. You're going to have lots of difficulty keeping them out. Some of the rest of these are we years ago, back in the 80s, people talked about, hackers as being almost, kind of cool. Or script kiddies. We still see them. Unfortunately, they don't get treated too kindly if they get caught, and they frequently get caught. So if you have young ones that are dabbling in this space, we encourage you to awaken them to certain realities, because the regulations that have been put in place to go after the really, really bad guys also apply to the not so well informed. Ignorance is no excuse for the law, as they say in some circles. So we've seen some of the authorities and the courts are happy to be a bit heavy-handed for some of the lower end folks. They're a nuisance, but they are still the possibility of growing into the more advanced forms that we really don't want to see. Why are they doing this? Money is a big part of this, but we're seeing right now the political aspects and military agendas are driving some of the really, really bad kind of stuff that we're seeing out there. Revenge plays in. I sort of point that one out. If you have irritated a customer, a supplier, an individual, often they can do a huge amount of damage to your organization on a scale that you might not realize that they could do if they're able to gain the right kind of access. This is a happy message, right? Okay. I thought I'd share a couple of things that we're seeing in 2023 in terms of breaches. So far we've seen roughly 73 public disclosed data breaches. These are sort of worthy of counting. Breached records, it's pretty small. It's only about 80 million records. So if you kind of do the math, you can see that that's a lot of people. The number of breaches in 2023, well, so that's, so the number of data breaches in 2023, we think are about 767 in total, with the number of breach records at just under 700 million. The biggest one we've seen is sort of a cleanup from Twitter, now X. Maybe it's a good thing they changed their name. There's 220 million breach records there. Where are we seeing the action? Healthcare, education, and sort of public firms. So that's a lot of records. How many of you have healthcare? You've probably all been to some sort of school, and you probably deal with some sort of government. And you see that's a. So you've probably gotten some sort of notice. Yeah, Paul.
A record is like one person's data?
Yes. So you may have actually been hit multiple times. I personally have gotten 5 letters this year. Okay, some notable breaches and attacks. So MoveIt, hit in June. 200 organizations are basically affected. 1.75 million individuals potentially in play here. The T-Mobile adventure, this was one, it wasn't just one and done. It was multiple rounds. So we got about 37 million customers that have been potentially impacted on this. Young brands, being hit with a ransomware attack. There's concerns about maybe some PII that was stolen as part of that. And the one I find most interesting is, has anybody played with ChatGTP? Oh, come on, don't lie. Well, it turns out that even those folks were not immune. I mean, forgetting about the fact that you might actually be able to extract some useful data out of ChatGTP. Not that I have ever tried to do this today. But they have a subscriber program. And it turns out some set of their subscribers have basically been hit. But this list is showing you that so games and oh wait, there's a security company in there too, right? The attack. Not just one. Yeah, that's right. Although I will point out that LastPass, which is also a security company, their problem wasn't that their records were basically their PII was. They lost source code. So the crown jewels have basically sort of escaped off into the wild somewhere, which could result in later problems when whoever's gotten that has said, oh, well, let's do a little analysis on this and just see if we can find some weak spots. But that might not be a big problem, right? Except that a lot of folks are using this kind of software to deal with the authentication problem where we're not allowed to use the same password, and they need to be complex. And you see where this is going, right? So you've got a community that's attacking the tools we're using to try to secure and deal with behavior problems, like using the same password every year. So very active, not too impressive when you sort of look at the players here. Nobody's being singled out. Anybody will do if they can catch you. Okay, well, the plot gets better. So if you can't catch the bad guys, then you punish the victims. Oh, wait, that's the regulatory space. So, so what we're now seeing is lots of adjustments in cybersecurity laws and regulations. And I was being a bit facetious, but what's happening is if you are not keeping your house in order from a security perspective and you have a data breach, besides the regulators, if you're a publicly traded company, your shareholders, you see where this is going. The lawyers start getting really excited. And you're in for lots of fun. But if you didn't have your house in order, then it gives the regulators the ability to basically come after you. And we're seeing lots of new regulations. The same thing happening in the privacy space. And privacy and security are not the same thing, but privacy usually has a dependency on security. So if you're living or operating in a space where privacy is kind of core to your business, or you may have customers, then the security could be a double whammy if it's not handled correctly. All right, so in the US, because we don't really have a national cybersecurity regulation, it's spread out all over the place. Different sectors have some don't. The states have basically said, we can take care of this. And of course, there is no consistency in terms of what's going on. And since you're here in the lovely state of California, how many of you live here? Okay, so then you have something there. But a lot of our security requirements and regulations are around reasonable security. And I had to give a talk at the Florida bar. Florida bar is where all the lawyers in Florida get together, and I got to terrorize them. Oh, I shouldn't use that word. So I got to talk to them about ethics. Remember, lawyers and ethics, and and yeah, it was a very short conversation. But we got to talking about the sort of the cybersecurity angle and the importance of this issue, and they were just all excited because this is a reasonable security is basically whatever they can argue in front of a judge and a jury. And depending on which side of that you're on, could be good, could be bad. And a lot of them are like, this is a revenue opportunity. So, but from a regulatory standpoint, this means you could get caught up fairly easy, because if somebody says, well, you should have been able to take care of that, how come you didn't? Then you may be on the receiving end of one of these that's not particularly good. And to give you an idea, I know of a couple of law firms, I won't name them, that have IT security department bigger than most enterprises, big enterprises. And the way they keep that activity funded when they're not like doing forensics or whatnot is they'll just pick a vendor and a product and on your behalf do security scans and then file something with the court. And the settlement is it gets sealed. You pay for the cost of all their security people investigating your product. And of course, there's never a disclosure, but that's how they keep the security team funded. So if you got like 50 or 60 security people, you got to keep them busy. So almost any product can be picked out and they go after it. So this is how some of these law firms are maintaining sort of their funding levels and staffing levels, even when lawsuits are kind of going up and down. So point being, lots of activity in this space. It's easy to get caught up in this kind of stuff. All right. So we're seeing some transitions in some of the security frameworks. Hopefully you've heard of the NIST cybersecurity framework. Have you heard this? Is this something, maybe? Okay. It's the 2.0 version is under development. The ISO 27000 series, so if your organization has a 27001 certification, that you're familiar with this. If you touch credit cards, then you know payment card industry data security standard. If you are doing something with the US government and you're holding some of their data in your systems, then you know about the cybersecurity maturity model certification kinds of activities. Point of this is there's a lot of new stuff happening in here. A lot of these were transitioning from an old to a new, or were under development. It means your security professionals in your organization are most likely a bit distracted dealing with this. Distracted equates to grouchy. So if you are doing something or not doing something and they catch you or spot it, they're likely to be, kind of in your face, because they're having to adjust a lot of the work that they're doing here. This also means a bit of chaos, and the bad guys love chaos. So as we're doing these kinds of transitions, it potentially creates opportunities that wouldn't normally be available to the attacker community. Okay, so what's in it for you from a developer's perspective? Well, as a starting point, I like to use this because you'll hear terms like information security, and you hear this personal data protection and cybersecurity. How does this stuff all interrelate? Well, in many ways, there is some overlap, but a lot of these are actually different kinds of things. And depending on who you're talking with, it may be a very large scope item, might be sort of smaller scope. But this is kind of the space that we're having to deal with, back to attackers and motivations and everything. It falls into this sort of broad spectrum of areas that we've got to worry about. Why do you care? Well, and what should you be potentially dealing with? We're seeing scenarios where if you're developing products and you've not really put security into them, you may be blocked out of certain sectors or certain jurisdictions. We think that's going to increase significantly over time. If you have security, but by default, it's not on, it's almost as bad as if you didn't have it. And years ago, and there's often this opinion that not turning on the security makes it more complicated to integrate the product, but in some cases, it may actually expose you to some level of liability. You knew you needed it, but you didn't enable it, it's kind of a hard argument if something gets dropped into a customer environment and it wasn't on and they didn't know it needed to be on. So those are the kinds of things to sort of pay attention to that. Vulnerability management is a huge issue. Understanding, well, one, having a program that tries to eliminate them before it goes out, product goes out the door, but being able to respond to vulnerabilities that are found, being able to disclose them, because failure to disclose, again, might expose you to the legal community. You may give them an angle for why they need to sort of come visit you. Just poor hygiene from cyber hygiene perspective may expose a company to litigation and the regulatory bodies. And we're seeing increasingly, they're looking at boards of directors. Where's the expertise on the board that knows something about IT and maybe something about security? And privacy has already kind of nailed this if you're operating in that kind of space. Source code and you're designing, we're seeing outright thefts of source code. Part of it's so that they can ransom it back to you. Part of it's so that they can go and look and see if there's an opportunity to go after your customers because you had some sort of vulnerability in your code. So this is where some of these advanced attackers like organized crime, nation states, this is the kind of thing that they're basically after. Ransomware, we already talked about it. It's proving to be a very valuable business for the dark side, so to speak. And it's now a multi-tiered event. The folks that are developing the code often aren't the ones executing the actual ransomware attack. So this is where it's ransomware as a service. So they will sell you or lease you the tools to go after a company. And the fee is 30% of your take, or maybe more. The problem with that is, if you catch the person doing the attack, you may not have actually gotten the enabler. Because some of this, it's not against the law to produce the tools, it's against the law to use the tool. And this is one of those little problem areas that we haven't figured out how to sort of plug this sort of problem. But this is what's going on, and we're seeing it increasing, which means you've got a lot of low-end players going after a lot of small organizations or even individuals because they're not trying to get the multi-million-dollar score. The ones that are after the big bucks are basically leasing the tools. And this bottom item is dealing with supply chain concerns, and we're seeing a serious uptick in lots of enterprises and governments about injection of malicious code, backdoors, vulnerabilities that could potentially be exploited. And in the case of the nation states and organized crime, they're perfectly happy to pay somebody to go work for your company and accomplish this. You pay them $30,000 a year. The bad guy pays them $300,000 a year. They're happy as a clam to do what they need to do. And so organizations are having to look internally as to who they have on their books to help avoid some of this. All right. Again, a response from the governments and whatnot is how to deal with products, making sure that they have, they pass the security giggle test. Well, we're starting to see interest in certification. This is usually an optional thing, at least from a US perspective. Certification is optional for vendors to do it, unless you're dealing with the US government, and then you've got to basically deal with FIPS 140, which I believe there's a talk later this week on FIPS 140, or how to use it. The second point here is the one that I'm watching fairly closely, and I think several of us in this room are. The Europeans are making noise about requiring product certifications when the product is sold in anywhere in the EU. And this would most likely be under common criteria. SNIA had a storage security summit about 18 months ago, and we actually had somebody come in from Europe that's heavily involved with these certifications. And he basically gave us a heads up that, as an industry, you probably want to be looking at this and think about what you can do in advance to be ready for this. What's happening right now is the EU is consolidating its national certification programs. So each of the 27 countries has their own thing. They're collapsing it into a single EU-wide. They're getting close to having that wrapped up. When that's done, you can expect they're going to turn and say, now that we have this under control, bring on the products to get them certified. So something to watch. And I mentioned the reasonable security issue. We are beginning to see regulations that focus in on particular technologies. So in California, we have some IoT regulations that are looking at specific features in consumer IoT kinds of things. The Biden administration has issued some activities around a labeling program for consumer IoT. So labeling program would be cybersecurity, did you pass the giggle test kind of thing. And there was work underway. So we expect that this is going to continue to grow. When you say IoT in the state of California, I believe that's everything except switches and routers. Cars, phones, everything else is sort of swept into the definition. So don't think that it's like a little sensor. It's much broader than that. So if you're thinking about certification, then you need to be looking at your system security engineering practices, one that you should probably have some, because most likely you're going to have to expose some of this when you go to get certification. You'll need the documentation that will help you certify that. You need to look at the vulnerability reports, because the labs that do these kinds of certifications or do the testing, they want to see what you've been doing, and then they're going to run their own set of tests. And anything that's in the public domain is typically fair game for them to exploit. It used to be you could make certain declarations and the network is not a threat, and then they couldn't challenge that. But no more. That game doesn't work anymore. These certifications are paper tiger for the most part, and so making sure that you have the right documentation, architectures, everything else are in hand. You need to be very clear about what assumptions you're making and that they're realistic. That's my comment about the network is not a threat. You could say that's my assumption, but it's definitely going to be challenged by either a lab or the certifying body.
Eric?
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what you mean by paper tiger. You're not saying that CC and FIPS 140 are ineffective.
I'm saying that to achieve that certification, you will supply a mountain of paperwork.
That kind of tiger.
And so that's one facet of it, but to more directly answer your question, many organizations will look at common criteria in FIPS 140 certification as a decent starting point, but it in no way is a declaration that your product is secure. So because they look at a particular facet. FIPS 140 is looking at your cryptographic modules. They don't care about anything else. Common criteria is supposed to look at all of the security features of the product, but it may or may not have been scoped to do it quite right. So it shouldn't be taken as it's a secure product. It just means it's been evaluated. So it's been scrutinized more than one that basically hasn't been certified. Keep in mind that, and I mentioned the laboratories, there is this third-party testing that's going on, and that process can be very expensive, especially if you walk in and you didn't do your homework. They're going to eat you alive the first pass, then you get to come do a second pass and maybe a third pass, and each one of those requires money. And you can give you an idea, sort of a decent, like a level 2 FIPS 140, level 2 common criteria, you could burn anywhere from 3 to 12 months if you've basically got your act together and blow $250,000. These are not cheap adventures, and these are all make and model. So you've got to be strategic about what you go after, because if you make one change, it may actually invalidate your certification. So from a developer's perspective, if this is on your roadmap, there's quite a bit of strategy that has to be employed to make sure you're dealing with this. All right, so beyond certifications, as a developer or developer community, as I said, you need to be worrying about your vulnerability management and disclosure program. How do you find them? How do you respond to a customer finding them? And how do you do that in a timely fashion? Because in some environments, you may have anywhere from hours to days. You don't have 120 days to deal with these. In fact, in some instances, you may be contractually obligated to provide a fix within 30 days. If your contracting officer just kind of signed off on the standard contract, which a lot of contracting officers do, I've seen some pretty scary things in this vulnerability management and disclosure program. You want to be known as a trustworthy supplier. So if you can be upfront about your security, the certifications kind of help play into this, but you need to be thinking about, how do I convince a customer who is maybe not buying all the marketecture kinds of conversations. They want to see a little bit of proof. Software development is key. We see huge numbers of vulnerabilities and attacks being perpetrated against our software. So having security as part of that process is critical. Incident response internally for you, so that you can stay alive, your company can stay online, but also helping companies, your customers, deal with their incident response. So we've seen several attacks. Managed services became the source of an attack for customers, and being able to sort of participate in that. This means you know up front what you're going to do, who you're going to contact. So if you found a problem, who gets notified? How does this get tracked in your organization? Cyber recovery solutions. This is an area where the storage industry is actually coming to play. Think of this as a backup of your backups. Attackers, ransomware, they know your infrastructure. They've basically been sitting in it for probably 6 months. They know who's accessing what. They know what systems are interacting. The first thing they're going to attack and poison is your backup server. Because if you can recover your data, they're not going to get paid. So they're going to go after any of your backup mechanisms. So having some alternate mechanisms that aren't necessarily visible to the attackers doing reconnaissance may be a way to stay alive. And there are multiple storage vendors that are operating in this space. And cyber insurance. Cyber insurance is, I don't know how helpful it's going to be if you don't get your business back and you have a cyber insurance policy. Somebody's get some money, but you're basically out of business. So you got to be realistic about it. The other thing that's happening with cyber insurance is they're in it to make money. They do payouts, but if you're doing something stupid like not taking care of your business, you don't have security under control, you may not even be able to get the insurance. And if you do get it, they may not have to pay. And also keep an eye on some of the terms and conditions, like, well, is that a terrorist attack? Is that an act of war? Because they don't pay out on those kinds of adventures. So oftentimes this is, oh, I'm not going to do anything, I'm just going to go get insurance. But when you actually get in here, you may find that it's not actually a valid thing to do. All right, so looking forward, first of all, it's not going to get any better. So it's kind of a dark crystal ball here. This reasonable security aspect, if you hear that, that should be, meters go off like, uh-oh, I need to understand, what that potentially means. And we're seeing a transition in some states to now talking not reasonable security, but risk-based. Risk means you understand kind of your exposure and what you need to do, and you know what you're doing or not doing. This transition is a little trickier for you to defend yourself against lawsuits if there are data breaches. Supply chain security, this is definitely an issue. I think one of the interesting ways of sort of showing this, we're talking about post-quantum crypto in some circles, right? So the US government is like, we want it in this time frame. Well, then they're turning to their suppliers saying, we want it in this time frame, but we don't want you to wait until the drop dead date. We want it, like midway. So it's a 10-year window. 5 years into this transition, we'd like to be here. Well, their top tier are then going to their suppliers and going, well, I got to be ready, at 5 years. So I need it from you in 2 years. So this is an example where the supply chain is having to deal with, getting security features in a certain way, but we're also seeing that certain security is not being addressed in certain members of the supply chain, and they're getting shut out. We're also seeing that vendors that have certain certifications may get a pass, or you don't have to answer the 90-page security questionnaire. You get the 10-page version of the questionnaire. So there's a whole bunch of things that are happening in the supply chain space that things that you do may help you or hurt you in that arena. A few of us, like Paul, John, myself, Glenn, are dealing with this circular economy. And where we're having to deal with it is, so this is reusing technology. But one of the issues that we run into is you can't actually reuse IT if it's got storage in it, unless you made the data go away in some reasonable fashion. There's that reasonable word again. So what we're seeing is a definite uptick in interest on things like standardization, and there's a talk coming up shortly on this, but it's playing into this circular economy. So this is one of the areas where security is actually got a seat at the table and something to basically pay attention to. I already talked a bit about product security certifications. Their importance going up. We don't think that's going to slow down. How many of you heard of zero trust? Zero trust security, you know this term? Okay, so this is basically a new architecture. Well, it's not new, but it's getting a lot of airplay. It's been around for at least 20 years that I know of in some fashion. But it does fundamentally change the game. Their concept of perimeter doesn't exist in zero trust. It's, I don't trust you, I can interact with you, so we've got to work this out. That's the sort of layman version of this, but there's a lot of complexity in that. We're seeing transitions to this. It's primarily in the US government, but there are activities now sort of moving this into sort of the international arena. This does change the way potentially the products will ultimately sort of fit into the environment, because now you're thinking about policy enforcement points and I have to be able to protect myself, assume a hostile environment around me. That's a big change from a lot of the technologies being deployed now. Cloud and edge computing are exploding. That's not going to change. So again, that's back to your concept of a perimeter is for naught, especially when these technologies come into play. And I already made a little comment about post-quantum. We're seeing requirements are firming up. I wouldn't say they're hard-coded yet that you've got to absolutely deliver, but if you're a vendor and you're using encryption, then we're in the window where you need to start sort of paying attention to this, because you've got to figure out when you're going to have it so that if you're in the supply chain, you can respond to that. And if your suppliers aren't talking to you, you probably should be talking to them about this. Paul.
On the zero trust architectures, how far out before you think we'll start seeing requirements to be placed on vendors? Is that happening yet, or they're just still trying to gel with it?
I would say if you are a network vendor and you're working with Department of Homeland Security, for example, maybe a couple other of the government, agencies, you're already responding to it. In terms of a comprehensive set of requirements, I haven't seen that yet, but I know, some of the work, IEEE is looking at some guidance. There's multiple architectures. Cloud Security Alliance has been doing some work on this. So we're seeing sort of early signs of, well, for this particular part of your infrastructure, usually the networking, that's probably where we're seeing, some requirements, but not comprehensive. And like I said, right now, this is primarily a US activity, but there's work underway to actually inject this into the international space. So, okay. So storage security event horizon, hopefully, you know what media sanitization is? You've heard this term? All right, so the rest of you need to stay in the room because Paul's going to tell you what that is. So making data go away. There is a new standard, 2022. This is a significant update on this technology and definitely going into it. And there's new work going beyond this. So as the carbon footprint issue becomes more and more important, more likely you're going to see the need for sanitization. We're seeing a new version of the ISO standard on storage security will be published probably early December. So we're at a point where it's final draft international stage. No changes planned. And Keeper.io is a new encryption technology that we're seeing in the NVMe space. And a lot of work in terms of getting it specified. It's now been specified, and we're now at a point where I think we're looking for that killer application that it will solve the problem for. But think of this as fine-grained encryption that a host controls the key management. Drives, for example, control the actual encryption piece. So again, new opportunities here, possibly for cloud containers and VMs. Okay, so lots of security standards underway. We're seeing lots of changes, some new documentation. SNIA is actually in the process of updating 3 of its security white papers, one on encryption key management. In theory was published this week or is about to be. There's some work on fiber channel security and some work on data protection technologies. Those should be available in the coming months. Lots of new requirements coming in. We hope that exploiting some of this new functionality is going to help with protecting of data. Keep in mind that the security community is still operating under the trust but verify mantra. And that means you're going to have to sort of earn your seat at the table as a vendor. You're going to need to be trustworthy, going to be able to demonstrate that. And last but not least, plan to be attacked. Minimize the damage from that attack. Assume you're going to be had. Do you want them to get all of the crown jewels or just, the garnets? So try to find ways where you can sort of minimize your exposure. Keep it from an all or nothing kind of thing. And this is where looking at things like zero trust security might help you down the road. There's some resources that you can find. Hopefully these shouldn't be too surprising if you are familiar with security. The bottom one I've found in the past to be relatively helpful if you're trying to find materials to help you at a product level. You want to understand some things that you could do for a particular product. They have some benchmarks that work for certain operating systems, for example. So it's definitely a useful place to get some details. So with that, that's a bit of an update on what's going on in the storage security space. A little more lethal than it was last year. Lawyers are a lot more excited. Governments are getting a little more frantic. But the players seem to be pretty much the same, with maybe a slight adjustment on the nation states, which are very active at the moment and probably will continue to be for at least the Ukraine Russia situation calms down. So appreciate your time, and hopefully this was helpful for you. Do let us know if this is a useful kind of briefing for you in the future, and we take your input seriously. If there's any questions, I think we got maybe 1 or 2 minutes, but yeah, Glenn.
When you're charging the PCI DSS 4.0 transition, when is that transition supposed to be? What are people in the card industry companies require?
This particular transition is a lot longer than in the past. In the past, they would run about 12 months. This one is at least 18. I've seen up to 24 months. And they kind of popped it out without they've been talking about it for a while, and then it got popped out suddenly, and to keep the roar down, they gave an extended transition period.
When was the start date of that 24 months?
That was, I believe it was January of this year was the start date. So I think they're like halfway through, maybe a third of the way through. And the scary thing about PCI DSS is it's 12 requirements, and they don't change a whole lot, but the audit criteria go on for pages and pages and pages and pages, and they keep just adding to the audit criteria. So that's how it's all the same 12 requirements. It just keeps growing, and depending on what role you play, if you're a processor, or if you're like a store, your requirements change quite a bit.
You know what Link says? It's supposed to be completed by March 31st, 2024. Should have been early. Yes.
Yeah, good luck with that.
I don't want to hear what Glenn said.
Oh, sorry. He asked when the transition for PCI DSS 4.0 was, and my response was it was longer than the previous one, and he just checked, and it looks like it's March of 2024. So we're not that far off from it. Any other questions? Was this useful to you? I mean, is this any surprises? No surprises? Okay, so you're in the same.
Unlike all your other ones, now I'm scared.
Well, but everybody still has their lunch. That's, So I met that end of the metric. All right, well, thank you for your time.